Hello, BookTube, and welcome to our read-along of Nicholas Montserrat's 1951 best-selling novel, The Cruel Sea. This thing came out, and everybody loved it. It came out at just the right time. Came out at a time when the reading public was hungry not only for histories of the gigantic war that they had just lived through, but also heroic stories of that war, especially if, as in this case, those heroic stories were told in completely mundane terms. Nothing unbelievable. No sterling, larger-than-life Horatio Hornblowers. So Montserrat knew, I think, that he had a winner on his hands, and boy, oh boy, was that knowledge vindicated, because this thing was a big hit. And we are reading the novel. We are reading the novel itself for this read-along, The Cruel Steve. And we are reading the first two parts for this first segment. It doesn't have to be constrained to a month. We'll take as long as we need to. We'll do 2 parts per segment. And the first 2 parts that we're doing now are 1939. They are the beginning of the war, when Commander Erickson, who is Royal Navy, right to the tips of his fingers, has been given command of a corvette, the Compass Rose. That is a new kind of vessel. That cover illustration is pretty correct. It's a newish kind of vessel designed to work in escorts. The Royal Navy, all the navies of the world, learned very clearly in World War I the importance of escorts, because now shipping, England being an island, is utterly dependent on shipping, but the war effort just in general on all theaters is dependent on shipping, and there are now submarines. It's not a question of battleships blasting against battleships. There are now submarines. So you need escorts to help guard the civilian traffic. And that's what the HMS, the Compass Rose, and all of her classmates will do. As we're told early on in the first two segments that we're reading today, the thing is basically an ungainly platform for dropping depth charges. That's pretty much all it is. Erickson notes right away, even before the Compass Rose has moved at all from her berth, he can see right away that she's going to handle horribly at sea. And he turns out to be right about that. No handling at all, just bouncing around like a bean on a drum in heavy weather. And of course, the Compass Rose is going to be navigating some of the worst maritime weather anywhere in the world. So that's no small thing. It's extremely cramped. There isn't enough room for the crew. But in the chapters that we're reading, Erickson gets to know his crew. That's going to be a bit of a fraught process, because the war effort is bringing in all sorts of conscripted and volunteer amateurs. People from a naval reserve that are not Royal Navy. They have not been taught in the finest traditions of sodomy, rum, and the lash. They don't know any of that. Perfect case in point are not so much his first officer, a man named Bennett, a coarse Australian who at least has experience, but as we're going to see, he's completely useless. But the 2 sub-lieutenants, the 2 other people who will run the ship, Lockhart and Farabee, are both perfect examples of editorial writers, ordinary suburban husbands, whatnot, ordinary people, just pressed into or volunteering into the naval service, getting a smattering of training, but usually never having logged more than an hour of sea time. All of a sudden, they're on board with a crew underneath them, with almost nothing to go on. One of the most comical aspects of that comes to the fore at the end of the 2 chapters that we're reading, the 2 sections that we're reading today, is that in addition to being a sub-lieutenant and then eventually first officer, Lockhart is just sort of thoughtlessly drafted into also being the ship's doctor. He has no medical training at all. He doesn't have any idea what to do. At one point in the pages that we're reading today, he says, next time we're on leave, I must buy a little book on medicine. They are mainly meant because the war is gearing up, and ships are going to be needed, crews are going to need it. Erickson knows he's going to need these men. We're told of Erickson. I have some little tabs here because I want to read you some of these bits, because I don't know when we're going to do another read along of The Cruel Sea. We're told of Erickson that he loved the sea, though not blindly. It was the cynical, self-contemptuous love of a man for a mistress whom he distrusts profoundly, but cannot do without. Not the last time that Montserrat will characterize the sea as not just a woman, but a prostitute. But we're told about the Compass Rose, about the Compass Rose's task in this war. A couple of different points in these pages, Montserrat just strikes a completely businesslike tone about what this is, about what's going to go on here. And it's got a kind of austerity Britain hunker down and get the job done ring to it that must have been part of making this book a success. We're told this then was going to be Compass Rose's battle. It really existed. It was worth taking on. It had to be won, and the sooner they were ready for it, the better. That's just wonderful. That kind of no nonsense, non romantic view of the war. We get that again in another segment. The more we are told about German U-boats and the havoc that they could reach. At the beginning of these chapters, we don't see that havoc, where Montserrat gives the Compass Rose a completely incident-free first convoy. No violence. But we know what's coming. Even if you haven't read the book, you know that the horrors of war are coming. But we're told it was indeed like a game of hide and seek. This is ships and U-boats hunting for each other on the vastness of the Atlantic. Played by a few children in an enormous rambling garden with the light sometimes fading and the grown-ups calling out directions intermittently. And if some of the children were vicious and cruel and pinched you when you were discovered, that was nothing unexpected in a nursery world. And we get these their first shakedown, the crew and Erikson getting to know each other. And the more that happens, the more we get a sense of what these people are like. Montserrat gives us some glimpses of their home life, a little. It's one of the few aspects of this book where if I had had his ear, I would have talked him out of it. We see that Erikson's wife is a dutiful non-entity who knits. Very strong echoes of Horatio Hornblower's wife. And we follow a couple of the other officers to their home lives. I guess it's to underscore the drama of what happens to them later in the book, but it seems off to me. But we also get to meet these officers when they're on board. And we meet the first officer. We meet Erikson's number one, a man named Bennett. And he's awful. And he is awful in exactly the same humdrum, workaday way that the rest of the book is. He's not a villain. He's not twirling his mustaches. We have all worked with people like Bennett. Someone who will posture and blow hard about his own authority, but when the minute his boss isn't looking, he won't do any work. He'll delegate and criticize and carp and pick on the weak people. Ferriby, in this case, one of the subs, is the weaker of the two. Lockhart can handle himself intellectually, but Bennett recognizes right away that he can make Ferriby's life a living hell, and he does. He's crude, and that continues to fly under Erikson's radar, but to be a daily experience for everybody else, including once the Compass Rose gets another sub-lieutenant. They add a third person. So it makes life easier for all of them, but that third sub-lieutenant is virtually Bertie Wooster. When he encounters Bennett for the first time, he doesn't even have any idea what the man is saying, much less that anyone could act this way. Just a perfectly beastly, monstrous person who is self-pitying and self-aggrandizing. It's not just that he's lazy, it's that he thinks he deserves better than a tiny, junky little Corvette. He wants more glory out of the war than just this. He certainly doesn't want to be banging around in this thing, especially after they all experience their first bed of bad weather, which does indeed make their lives miserable for 2 whole weeks. In a way that people who have not been to sea you won't have any conception of how bad it can get. You're it. That's all. You can't walk up the street for better conditions. That's it. That's all. It's soon after that horrible crossing. I'm going to read you a patch from that. But it's soon after that we get the idea that Bennett gets the idea that he and the Compass Rose are not a long-term marriage at all. But before that happens, he is just this nightmare on board. Erikson is thoroughly professional. He knows that he's got a mixture of professionals. His chief engineer, his artificer, is a professional, long-standing, who at first is a little resentful of the Compass Rose, thinks that he really ought to be working in the engine room of a destroyer, like the Viperus, the destroyer that actually works in tandem with Compass Rose in their convoy. He gains a respect for the Compass Rose, as the narrative says. Once the ship starts proving her mettle, he stops complaining about it and starts to defend her, which is wonderful. That happens in the background. A lot of stuff happens in the background of this book. A lot of it does. But Erikson knows that Bennett is toxic. It's totally against the traditions of the Royal Navy to play favorites, or to be seen to playing favorites, or to try to mother hen your younger officers. They're supposed to figure it out for yourself. Make the wardroom work on its own. Don't bring these kinds of personnel problems to my attention. He does what he can, but he's hoping the situation will work itself out. And it isn't going to. But in the background of all that, Bennett notwithstanding, Bennett does the bare minimum that he needs to keep his job, and not to be reported to the captain. But the crew comes together. During these shakedown cruises, during these first convoys, they start to learn. Lockhart and Ferriby have no idea what they're doing. They're looking up the signals that they have to give the other ships while they're trying to give them. They have no idea of protocols at all. Barely remember any of the wording that they learned from their orientation classes when all of a sudden they're out on the open ocean. And once again, Montserrat gives us a very clear indication of what that task is, and how it matters here. Let me get to my bookmarks here. He gives another little passage about how this is a job, it has to be done, we're the ones to do it. No use complaining, and no use doing it poorly. He says, we're told about the captain here. He was tired. He couldn't remember ever having been so tired. But he knew that he was not too tired. There were always reserves. It was part of the job of being captain, the reverse side of the prestige and respect and the saluting. The tiny ship, the inexperienced officers, the unbelievable weather. He had taken these all on as well, and they would not defeat him. So he dealt with everything that came, assuming all cares out of an overflowing strength. He was a professional, the only one among amateurs who might in the future be considerable assets to him, but at the moment were not very much help. And the professional job at sea was not without its rewarding pride. It had to be done anyway. He was the man to do it, and there was no choice and no two answers. It's possible that Montserrat carries this a little bit far when it comes to Erikson, especially the scene that we get when he's at home with his wife, where he feels uncomfortable even being in bed with her. And at one point during that scene, Montserrat makes mention of his naturally celibate nature, that he's married to the service. I think that might be taking things a little bit far, but one of the crew members mentions that they've got a new captain who's like something out of a movie. So maybe Erikson is a paragon. Certainly we'll get that impression later in the book. But I wanted to describe to you just a bit of Montserrat's description of some of the ugly weather that the Compass Rose faces. Because I would imagine that most of you listening to this read-along are thorough landlubbers. That's not an insult, right? That's a pretty good guess. I would imagine that most of you have never been on a vessel 4 days away from land. I'd guess that's true. So I wanted to describe just this passage to give you a sense of it, because Montserrat is so good at this sort of thing. There was one night he remembered especially toward the end of the trip, when the wind had veered to the north and the gale was at its height. A gigantic sea was running at them from the beam. Compass Rose would rise to it as if she were going up a lift, balance herself uneasily at its peak, and then fall away into the trough of the wave with a wicked sideways roll. Sometimes the next wave, towering up in its turn, would catch them as they lay there sluggishly and beat down on them before they could rise. That was the moment when the heart quailed, when solid tons of water fell with a thunderous drumming on the bridge and the upper deck, and the spray flew over in clouds, wind-driven and cutting. The storm was indeed incredibly noisy. The water crashed and thudded against their side. The wind howled at them out of the blackness as if it had a conscious intention of terror. Round them was nothing but a waste of sea, a livid gray whipped up here and there to white foam. And then beyond it, like a threatening wall, the surrounding dark, the chaos and flurry of the night. Now, it's true that Montserrat also balances those descriptions with a couple of lovely descriptions of days that aren't like that. of the few days when the ship is running perfectly and the weather is beautiful. We are told in one of those scenes in these two sections of the book that on those days it seems absurd that they're even being paid to do this because it's so lovely. Again, it's an idyll. It's going to end, and it does. These two sections end with two important things. Before we move on to the next two, these two sections end with two important things. One is small and one is big. The small thing is that Bennett actually does get himself invalided out. He pretends to have a duodenal ulcer and really thinks that he needs to be transferred out. And there isn't much in the way of strenuous objection to that from anybody. And the captain looks to Lockhart and says, well, we're shipping out. We can't wait for him to get better, and we can't wait for a replacement. So you'll have to act as first officer. And I'll be right here with you the whole way. By this point, even early in this book, Lockhart is coming to worship Erikson. Not just for how professional he is, but also for those odd flashes of very laconic humor that Lockhart really appreciates, whereas Bennett wouldn't recognize that a joke was being told, and Farragut would be too afraid to say anything, and probably wouldn't recognize that a joke was being told. And also the new sub, Morrill, I'm sure that he never stops thinking of Erikson by their different classes. But Lockhart starts to appreciate the guy. Not just to appreciate his command, but to appreciate him. But Erikson tells him, you're just going to have to do it. I will be with you every step of the way, but we don't have time. That's the small thing that happens, is that Bennett leaves. All of a sudden, the wardroom is happier, and the ship is working better. Even the people down in the lower decks with their individual tasks all hated Bennett. They recognize that a better hand is in charge. That's the small thing. And the big thing is that the Compass Rose is blooded. The idyll ends. And suddenly the convoy is attacked by a plane, submarines. That scene that I just read of gigantic waves crashing onto the ship, at one point they lose a ship that is simply crushed by the water. Just broken into pieces, and everyone on board. But there's also violence. There's also battle. And the first instance of the choice that Erikson and his crew are going to have when it comes to saving people out of the water. They're going into the water with wounds and also burned with oil. And they're going to drown. So they need to be rescued. But if you stop to rescue them, not only do you have no chance of chasing the submarine that did the damage, but you're not moving anymore. You're not zigzagging in your path. You're a sitting target for them to strike you. So what do you do with survivors in the water? These are questions that the Compass Rose has not thought of. Erikson has not thought of it. No one has. And they are what ends these two segments. Is that this is no longer an innocent gamble for the ship. The war is now on in earnest. One of the odd historical points that Montserrat makes in these sections is that the thing that really kicks things into overdrive is Dunkirk. After which it's no longer play. After which there will be warships, there will be casualties, there will be airplanes, and there will be tenders and corvettes out there taking the brunt of the action. It's their job to drop the depth charges. So that's where we end this point in the Cruel Steve read-along. We'll move on to just the next two parts next time. We won't worry about whether or not we finish neatly in a month. We'll do the next two parts for next time. So I'll wrap this up. I hope you're enjoying it, those of you who are doing this, and we'll be back. Thank you.